Hey there, welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, settle in. You picked a good night to get a little uncomfortable before bed. While you're here, give this a like if you enjoy strange, grim, oddly relaxing history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far this reaches in the quiet hours. Now, let's dim the lights, maybe adjust your blanket, get that background hum going, because tonight's story isn't what you think. You've seen them in games, hooded, silent, deadly, slipping across rooftops with steel, and purpose like ghosts on a mission. But real medieval assassins, they weren't sleek shadows with stylish weapons and clever exit plans. They were desperate, dirty, often drunk, and almost always disposable. This grimy man in a cloak may look like your favorite game protagonist, but he's not what you think, because being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. No fame, no future, just a dagger, a coin pouch, and a name whispered by someone who might pay you or might bury you. So, before we start painting that romantic picture, let's take a quiet walk into the shadows and meet the kind of man who didn't choose this life but got dragged into it anyway. Let's be real. Nobody woke up in medieval Europe dreaming of becoming a knife for hire, but someone had to do it, because when kingdoms trembled and noble families whispered murder over wine, it wasn't the knights in shining armor who got the job done. It was the invisible ones, the ones with nothing left to lose. See, the world back then didn't care much for fairness. Power moved through back doors and backstabs, and sometimes the only thing standing between a fragile peace and full-blown war was one silent man and one ugly decision. If these assassins didn't exist, if someone hadn't agreed to slip into a guarded bedroom and make one person stop breathing, entire cities might have burned. The wrong heir could have taken the throne. A war that should have ended might have dragged on for another bloody decade. And don't be fooled into thinking it was all politics. Sometimes it was just petty revenge dressed in noble clothes. One man's insult turned into another man's contract. The stakes? Simple. Do the job, and maybe history forgets your name. Fail, and everyone remembers you, just long enough to make an example of you in the town square. So yeah, the role might have been invisible, but the consequences, they were loud, public, and soaked in consequences. No one ever thanked you for surviving. Let's set something straight before we dive any deeper. Nobody in medieval Europe aspired to be an assassin. There were no childhood dreams about sneaking into a fortress or slipping poison into someone's wine. No proud fathers boasting, "That's my boy," third-generation throat slicer. No villagers saving up for tuition to assassin school on a mountain. That's fiction. The real story, it's sadder, quieter, and a lot more desperate. Becoming a medieval assassin wasn't a calling. It was what happened when your life fell apart in ways you couldn't recover from. You didn't choose it. You landed there, hard. And by the time you did, you weren't looking for glory. You were just looking for a way to eat, to survive, to matter to someone, even if that someone wanted you to disappear afterward. Most assassins weren't noble warriors with mysterious pasts and secret code names. They were people society had already forgotten. A disgraced soldier who took the wrong side in a civil war. A thief who got too comfortable in the shadows. A peasant who'd lost everything to famine, plague, or taxes that never seemed to end. These weren't hardened killers. Not at first. They were the broken, the overlooked, and the nameless. And that's exactly why they were hired. Because if you had a title, land, or even a goat in your name, you didn't become the blade. You paid for it. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, knew how to move through a tavern without making a sound, and had a look in your eyes that said you weren't afraid to do terrible things for very little reward, someone, somewhere, would notice. And it was never for something small. You weren't being sent after the town drunk or the baker's apprentice. No, the name whispered across the table was usually wrapped in layers of danger. A corrupt baron with guards, a merchant with ties to 3 rival families, a bishop who'd gotten greedy, loud, and inconvenient. These were not easy marks. They were high profile, well protected, and paranoid. The pay? Tempting. The job? Near suicidal. But by the time someone took it, the math didn't matter. You had nothing left to lose. That's the part people forget. Assassins didn't operate from a place of strength. They worked from rock bottom. They didn't fantasize about power or legacy. They just needed enough silver to buy a week's worth of silence, maybe a hot meal, maybe a night in a dry bed. That was luxury. Retirement? That was a fantasy. Most of them didn't plan beyond the next job, because planning ahead required hope, and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. There was no resume, no job posting, no warm introduction. You didn't walk into a guild and announce your availability. You got noticed by accident or by rumor. Maybe someone saw how fast your knife hand moved when a fight broke out. Maybe someone heard you handled a problem for the local innkeeper and kept your mouth shut after. You solved a problem once, and now someone thinks you're the solution to theirs. That's how it started, with a whisper, with a coin purse, with a name, and you didn't say no because you couldn't. Not when your other options were freezing, starving, or rotting in a cell somewhere that nobody remembered building. You weren't trained. You weren't chosen. You weren't special. You were just quiet, useful, and completely disposable. And once you accepted that, truly understood what that meant, then, and only then, did you realize you weren't a person anymore. You were a tool, a very sharp, very silent, very lonely tool. So no, this wasn't a career path. This wasn't a job with prospects. It was a final stage, a closing chapter, a way to keep breathing for a few more days by becoming exactly the kind of ghost the world needed to do its dirty work, and then pretend it never saw. Let's talk about training, because if you've been picturing some candlelit monastery hidden in the mountains, where a hooded mentor teaches you pressure points and poison making while speaking in cryptic metaphors, I hate to break it to you, but none of that existed, not even a little. There were no manuals, no sparring matches with wise old masters, no daily drills in the rain with bamboo swords and ancient wisdom. Most assassins didn't get training. They got lucky once, and they learned very, very quickly that they probably wouldn't be that lucky twice. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a dagger the right way, and maybe even remembered which end to point at someone's throat. But most didn't. Most came from lives that had nothing to do with war or combat. They weren't soldiers or spies. They were hungry, broke, desperate. And now, they were being paid to kill someone with barely any idea how to do it. So how did they learn? The hard way, trial and error. With an extremely high error rate, you learned how to move quietly by sneaking through alleys, while praying your boots didn't betray you on the cobblestones. You learned which windows squeaked when you were halfway through them. You figured out how to blend into a crowd by watching which peasants the guards ignored and copying every single detail. You learned that most nobles had a body double. You learned that most castles had at least 2 exits out of every sleeping chamber. And you learned all of this while you were already inside, one hand on your knife, the other trying not to tremble. There was no one to teach you the ropes. No helpful pamphlet titled, "So You've Decided to Become an Assassin." If you were lucky, and I mean lightning strike lucky, an older assassin might take pity on you and share a few tips, like how to walk across a room without your belt buckle jingling, or how to keep your knife oiled so it didn't squeal when drawn. But even that was rare, because in this world, knowledge was survival, and no one wanted to give away something that kept them alive. Mentorship was not common. It was risky. Imagine training someone who might one day take your job, or worse, get caught and blurt out your name under torture. So most kept their secrets locked away, and if they shared anything at all, it was vague, riddled with half-truths, and usually ended with, "But don't quote me on that if you get caught." Weapons training? Forget it. You didn't have a customized sword or a signature move. You had a dagger you stole off a city guard, or maybe carved yourself out of scrap metal. If you were lucky, it was sharp. If you were really lucky, it wasn't already cursed by a bad kill. You didn't train with it. You used it in real time while your heart pounded loud enough to wake the entire manor. And poison? That was its own little nightmare. Making poison wasn't a science. It was guesswork, with heavy doses of folklore and desperation. You'd hear someone say a certain root could paralyze a man, only to find out it just gave him stomach cramps and a bad temper. Sometimes the poison worked too fast. Sometimes it didn't work at all. Sometimes you accidentally drank the wrong cup because the lighting was bad and the host served soup in matching bowls. There were no labels, no dosage charts, no use as directed, only rumors, herbal superstition, and hope. And hope you learned by surviving. That was the curriculum. If you failed a job, you didn't get a debrief or constructive feedback. You got dead, maybe on the spot, maybe the next day when your client realized you left behind too many clues, maybe weeks later when someone you didn't even recognize cornered you and whispered, "You missed." Success wasn't even a guarantee that you'd get better. It just meant you didn't mess up this time. Maybe you were quiet, maybe you were fast, maybe the guard had a cold and didn't hear you slip in. It wasn't a win, it was a pass. And you didn't collect experience points. You collected trauma, and eventually, patterns. Things you'd noticed once, then twice, then enough times to start trusting them, like how noblemen often took their boots off before bed, or how a bishop always locked his bedroom window, except on Thursdays after wine. That was your education. Not from books, not from teachers, from bruises, bloodstains, and scars that never healed clean. And even then, there were no graduation ceremonies, no promotions, no official recognition, just the creeping realization that the more jobs you did, the less you slept, the more you killed, the more you had to wonder which part of you was still human, and which part had just become routine. So no, assassins weren't trained. They were forged by desperation, by failure, and by the cold, constant fear that the next kill would be the one they got wrong. Let's talk about payment. Because yes, someone technically hired you. Yes, they technically offered silver. And yes, there was usually a promise. Half now, half later. The classic line, the hook that made you sit still long enough to hear a name that would probably haunt you. But here's the thing, nothing about that promise meant it was going to happen. Being a medieval assassin didn't just mean risking your life for coin. It meant gambling your life on the idea of coin. The people who hired you, nobles, merchants, bishops, with enemies and dirty secrets, didn't come to you out of trust. They came to you because they needed something done that couldn't be traced back to them. And once it was done, your usefulness expired the moment your target stopped breathing. So let's break it down. How did you get paid? Most of the time, it started with a meeting in the dark. Not always literal, but always hidden. A coin purse slid across a table. A name whispered low. Sometimes a vague sketch. Sometimes just a location and a warning. Don't make it messy. You might get 10 silver coins up front, or whatever, passed for payment in the local economy. Bread, clothing, sometimes favors. One scribe reportedly paid an assassin with a bag of rare herbs and access to a bathhouse. Generous, in theory, but mostly it was coin, cold, heavy, and just enough to tempt someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days. The other half? That came after the job, after the cleanup, after the walk back through streets where your face might already be described to every guard on the payroll. So, what went wrong? Everything. Almost always. Because after the job is code. It means after we verify you didn't mess it up, leave a trail, get recognized, botch the timing, or survive long enough to tell someone who hired you. That last one, that's the big one. Because every job you survived made you more dangerous to your client. Let's be clear. A dead assassin was a clean assassin. One who couldn't talk, couldn't blackmail, couldn't change sides, couldn't become a liability. And in a world where nobles were more concerned with their reputations than their debts, the logic was simple. Why pay someone when a knife in the back is cheaper? Some clients ghosted you entirely, vanished, changed names, left town before the ink dried on the contract. Others took a more direct route. They sent someone to meet you, someone polite, someone armed. The client thanks you, they'd say, right before slipping a blade between your ribs. Bonus, not included. And when you did get paid, it still wasn't worth it. Not really. The amount varied. Sometimes you were paid like a prized mercenary. Other times, like a street rat. Reports from 13th century Venice describe freelance killers receiving anywhere from 5 to 50 denarii, barely enough for a few nights at an inn, a meal, and a good lie about your profession. In London, court records show cases of hired murders being paid the modern equivalent of a few $100s to assassinate political rivals, jealous spouses, or even clergy. Imagine that, risking your life to quietly kill a bishop for what amounts to 2 nights' pay at a decent tavern. You'd bleed in the shadows while your client sat safe behind walls, pretending they'd never heard your name. And here's the worst part. Even before the betrayal, most of the money was gone by the time it hit your palm. You had to bribe a doorman, pay for forged papers, hire someone to distract a guard dog, maybe buy a disguise, maybe stock up on poison ingredients or tools. By the end of the job, you were lucky if you broke even. The job didn't make you rich. It just delayed poverty for a week, maybe 2. Then the hunger would come back, and so would the need to kill again. And sometimes, the entire thing was a trap. Yes, fake contracts existed, political bait. You'd be handed a name, told this person was dangerous, told they had to die quietly, so you sneak into their estate. You climb the walls, you make it past the guards, and then torches, crossbows, waiting soldiers, because the whole thing was staged. You weren't hired to kill. You were lured to take the fall for a failed coup. to clear a rival, or just to be made an example of. They already had your name carved into the gallows. One wrong turn, and you went from invisible blade for hire to known traitor of the crown, usually complete with a public execution and a very unflattering woodcut of your face. And did you think you could report this, file a grievance, take it to court? Of course not. You weren't officially anything. If you survived and showed up demanding justice, the court would ask your name, your occupation, your purpose, and you'd be lucky if you made it out without being accused of witchcraft, heresy, or attempted murder. There was no protection, no legal recourse, no backup plan. Once you took the job, you belonged to it, and if your employer decided you weren't worth the risk, you became part of the cleanup. So what did you do? You learned fast. You demanded more up front. You watched your back. You never met in the same place twice. You learned to walk into a room and instantly know who might stab you, who might betray you, and who already had. You slept with a blade under the mattress. You never turned your back to a client, even when they smiled. And still, it wasn't enough, because you weren't just doing a job. You were stepping into a world where loyalty was fake, promises were short-lived, and every silver coin felt like a loaded question. How long before you outlive your usefulness? And the answer? Not long. Never long. Let's take a moment to talk about gear, because if you're picturing retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, and crossbows hidden in your boot, I'm going to need you to lower your expectations by a lot. The medieval assassin didn't have gear that would impress anyone. In fact, they barely had gear that worked. There was no secret armory, no enchanted dagger passed down by a forgotten master, no tool belt filled with alchemical poisons or throwing knives balanced for perfect rotation. What you had, if you were lucky, was whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide in your clothing without making too much noise. Let's start with the basics. The dagger, your most reliable weapon, wasn't a masterpiece of metallurgy. It was a knife, probably dull in places, probably pitted with rust, probably taken from a guard you distracted, or a corpse you were unlucky enough to find first. There was no elegance to it, no artistry, just a hunk of metal that needed to be sharp enough to end someone's life before they screamed. That was it. That was the standard. Some daggers were curved, some were straight, some had handles wrapped in cloth, leather, or whatever wouldn't slip in your hand if things got messy. And messy, they always got. If you were really prepared, and I mean obsessively cautious, you carried a backup, not a second dagger, but something makeshift, a belt buckle with a jagged edge, a sharpened nail, a piece of slate roofing tile that could be slammed against a throat. Because if your blade broke, or worse, fell down a drain mid-job, you had to improvise or you were as good as dead. Next up, poison. It's romanticized. We picture a drop in a goblet, a subtle swirl of the wrist, and a nobleman gasping his last breath during a toast. Reality was a lot more chaotic. Most poisons available in the Middle Ages were inconsistent, slow, and just as likely to affect the wrong person. You didn't have labeled vials or measured doses. You had crushed herbs, mushrooms, minerals, and in some cases, animal parts. Think toad guts and moldy roots. Think trial and error, heavy on the error. You learned to test poisons on rats, if you could find one. If not, you just guessed. Sometimes the result was instant paralysis, sometimes just stomach cramps, and sometimes the victim got dizzy, went to bed early, and woke up furious. Now you weren't just a failed assassin, you were a known one. Then there was rope, probably the most versatile and least romantic tool in your kit. You didn't carry fancy grappling hooks or neatly coiled silk cords. You had hemp rope, thick, itchy, fraying at the ends. If you were lucky, it had knots tied in the right places so you could climb quickly. More often, it tangled, it snagged, it made noise, it smelled like livestock, but it was useful. Rope could help you scale a wall, secure a door, drag a body, or in extreme cases, end a life quietly. Life quietly. That is, if you knew the right knot. Most didn't, which led to a lot of very awkward and very loud struggles in the dark crossbows of fantasy. You didn't carry one unless you were part of a military unit or incredibly wealthy. They were bulky, obvious, and nearly impossible to hide. Reloading one took time, and time was the one thing you didn't have. Assassins worked up close. Crossbows were for guards, for hunters, not for someone trying to vanish. After the job, smoke bombs, myth, nothing like what you've seen in games or movies. Sure, you could set fire to oil-soaked rags or throw something that produced a little smoke, but that was less a tactical exit and more a last-ditch panic move, one that usually set the wrong part of the building on fire. Then there was the real gear, your clothing. No sleek black outfit tailored for movement. No armor lined with secret compartments. You wore what would help you blend in. Peasant rags, a monk's robe, a guard's uniform you'd stripped off a sleeping man and hoped still smelled enough like him to pass. Your job wasn't to look cool. It was to disappear. And disappearing meant dressing like someone nobody wanted to look at twice. You hid your dagger in your boot, or your sleeve, or your belt, maybe even inside a loaf of bread. You carried poisons in wax-sealed jars, buried deep in satchels of dried herbs to mask the smell. You wrapped rope around your waist and prayed it didn't chafe so loudly that someone noticed you walking funny. Everything you owned had to be silent, fast, and disposable, because if you got caught, you wouldn't get a second chance to explain what it was for. No one cared about context when you were found carrying a garrote and a poison vial near the bishop's kitchen. You weren't kitted out. You were held together with desperation, frayed cloth, and a few bad ideas you hoped would work this time. There were no upgrades, no blacksmith waiting to customize your tools, no safe house full of better options. You didn't tinker, you didn't optimize, you used what didn't get you killed last time. And when it broke, you didn't mourn it. You replaced it with whatever you could find, a brick, a bone, a bottle, because you weren't just an assassin. You were a survivor, a scavenger, someone who lived one step behind death and one breath ahead of discovery. Your toolkit wasn't built in a forge. It was built in panic, and every item in it whispered the same truth. This might work, but if it doesn't, nobody's coming to help. So, you've got the job, you've got your blade, you've picked your cloak. Maybe you even got lucky and someone owed you a favor. A door left ajar, a key borrowed from a sleepy servant, a tip about the guard rotation that might, just might, still be accurate. But now comes the part everyone forgets. The target. Because in the stories, they make it look easy. The assassin glides across rooftops, enters the chamber. The mark is alone, unguarded, already half asleep. One silent move, one clean kill, then a gentle fade into the night. But in real life, that door isn't just locked. It's triple barred, flanked by men in chainmail, and guarded by a dog who hasn't eaten since yesterday. You aren't facing a drunk merchant asleep in his soup. You're facing someone important, someone paranoid, and killing important people is never simple. Let's start at the outer edge, the castle itself. It's not a house, it's a fortress, a machine of stone built for one purpose: to keep people like you out. There's no just sneak in. The outer walls are 20 feet high, manned by archers who are bored, cold, and itching for an excuse to loose an arrow. The gates are reinforced oak wrapped in iron bands. The courtyards echo. Even your own heartbeat might betray you. Most castles had multiple defensive layers. A moat, not always filled with water, sometimes just spikes or muck deep enough to trap your legs and swallow your shoes. The drawbridge, if it was down, creaked with age and shouted your presence every time your foot touched it. If it was up, well, then you were swimming, in the dark, in water that likely held leeches, rats, and worse. Then came the murder holes. These charming little ceiling cutouts were placed above entryways and narrow halls, perfect for dumping boiling water, hot oil, or sand that clung to your skin and burned deep. The moment you triggered an alarm, the walls themselves became hostile. Architecture turned into a trap, and that was just the welcome mat. Let's say, somehow, you make it past the outer defenses. Now comes the servants, staff, and sentries. You might not think about them much, but they're everywhere. Cooking, cleaning, carrying scrolls from room to room. They know who belongs and who doesn't. They notice things, like the unfamiliar man who doesn't know where the well is, or who forgets the name of the head cook's cat. Medieval households ran on familiarity, and if one chambermaid whispers to a guard that there's someone strange in the hall, you have minutes, maybe seconds. Then there are the dogs, not pets, not companions, working animals trained to smell wrongness. Some were small and barked at anything. Some were massive and didn't bark at all. They just bit. Let's not forget the guards. These weren't the bumbling drunks of fantasy. These were men hired specifically to protect someone who expected to be assassinated. They weren't just posted outside the door. Some slept outside it, some inside, sometimes 2, sometimes 12, and they rotated. They varied their patterns. They changed door codes. If there were any, you had to learn it all. Listen for footsteps, count the time between shifts, measure how long the corridor stayed silent. That alone could take days, sometimes weeks. And even if you mapped it all perfectly, your target was still the hardest part, because the people worth killing in the Middle Ages, they were never alone. Nobles didn't sleep peacefully in spacious chambers. They slept surrounded by guards, inside rooms with multiple exits, sometimes hidden ones even the staff didn't know about. They rotated their sleeping quarters. They used decoy beds. Sometimes they placed body doubles in those beds. Servants dressed in royal robes, asleep under duress. You'd think you completed the job, only to realize you'd just stabbed a poor cook's assistant who happened to wear the wrong tunic that night. And if they weren't in bed, they were at a feast. And that's where it gets worse, because now you're in a room full of people, all drunk, all loud, but all alert to strangeness. You're not slipping through shadows here. You're pretending to be invisible in plain sight, carrying a weapon, hiding intent behind a blank stare, waiting for that one perfect moment. That moment might never come, or it might come so fast you hesitate, and then it's gone. Even if the kill is successful, one clean strike, no scream, no spill. The escape is a second mission, all its own, because the guards, now they're not passive, now they're hunting. They've locked the gates, closed the bridges, stationed men at the wells, the stables, The docks. Dogs are tracking. Horses are galloping. Torches are lit. And you're bleeding. And your client, they're gone. They don't meet you at the tavern. They don't nod in thanks. They vanish. Because now, you are the most dangerous person alive. Not just to your target, but to them. You've seen too much. Done too much. You might talk. You might name names. The success of the job doesn't guarantee safety. In fact, it's the beginning of your most vulnerable hour. Every successful kill is followed by a flight through woods, over rooftops, into cellars and boats and barns, changing names, burning clothes, bribing guards, shaving your beard, or growing one, and all the while, the memory of the moment plays over and over in your mind. That breath before the blade, the weight of the body as it collapsed, the silence, the sudden noise. That was your job. That was your art. That was your curse. Because the higher the target, the stronger the defenses. And in a world built on suspicion and betrayal, every corridor had ears, every door had weight, and every nobleman slept under 10 layers of fear. So next time someone asks, why didn't the assassin just sneak in and get it done? Remind them, because castles were traps, because people talked, because walls had murder holes, dogs had good noses, and paranoia never slept. And neither did you. Let's take a moment to talk about disguises, because if you've imagined slipping into a noble's estate, wearing sleek black robes, a hood that billows just right, and maybe a leather harness full of secret pouches, you've been lied to. Medieval assassins didn't get wardrobes, they didn't get armor that folded into itself, and they definitely didn't get style points. In truth, you looked awful, and that was the point. To survive, you had to disappear into the background, not as a shadow, not as a specter, but as someone so painfully ordinary, no one bothered to remember your face. You didn't wear black. That drew attention. You wore brown, gray, the same mud-stained tones every tired stable boy and half-drunk beggar wore. And even then, you were still too clean, still too quiet, because the hardest part of blending in wasn't the fabric. It was you. Looking normal wasn't natural. Not when you were constantly carrying hidden blades and tracking every face in the room. Not when your heartbeat sped up every time a guard glanced your way. The more you tried to appear invisible, the more likely you were to look suspicious, and the people around you weren't fools. Medieval servants were observant. They had to be. Their lives depended on noticing things, small things, the way a man carried himself, the sound of boots that didn't belong, a limp that wasn't there yesterday, a monk who forgot the name of the local chapel, a vendor who didn't know the price of onions. You were always one casual question away from disaster, and the disguises themselves? They were a mess. You didn't have access to wardrobe changes or costume design. You had what you could steal, borrow, or build out of cast-offs. Maybe it was a monk's robe, stolen from a washing line, 2 sizes too big and reeking of incense. Maybe it was a peasant's tunic, complete with patched knees and a dried bloodstain you couldn't explain. If you were impersonating a guard, the armor was likely dented, too tight, and still had the sweat of its last owner soaked into the leather straps. And forget about masks. There were no black silk half masks or porcelain drama pieces. You didn't wear something over your face unless you wanted to look like a leper or a plague victim, which might buy you silence, sure, but would also make it impossible to get into a noble's dining hall. There were no wigs, no makeup kits. If you needed to look older, you rubbed ash or dirt into your beard. If you needed to look sick, You stopped eating for 2 days. If you needed to look like someone else entirely, you prayed. And even when your disguise worked, it didn't buy you safety. It bought you time, a few minutes, a few careful steps through a corridor, a chance to make someone think, he probably belongs here, long enough for you to pass by. But that illusion was delicate, because if anyone looked too closely, saw your eyes, noticed your boots, asked your name, the whole thing cracked. And when that happened, you didn't run, you vanished, or you fought, or you died, usually one of the three. Disguises weren't armor, they weren't magic, they were pressure, constant, creeping pressure. Imagine standing in a crowded hall, dressed as a servant, pretending to wipe tables, trying not to stare at the man you're supposed to kill, knowing you've only got one chance, knowing the blade in your sleeve might slip, or that the head cook might turn around and shout, "Who's that? I don't know him." Imagine being in a bishop's laundry room, wearing a stolen nun's habit, holding a dagger, and realizing today is a feast day, and the bishop is coming down the hall. That was the risk. Every disguise, every lie, was a razor's edge. One slip, literal or metaphorical, and you were dead, not arrested, not lectured, dead. No trial, no apology, just iron, fire, and rope. And even when you didn't fail, even when you pulled it off, when no one saw you, when you passed as a cook or a merchant or a tired little pilgrim, it took something from you. Every role you played blurred your reflection a little more, until one day, you weren't sure who you were pretending to be and who you actually were. That was the price. Not just survival, but identity, piece by piece. Because disguises protect you, yes, but they also erase you. And if you wear too many of them for too long, you don't vanish from sight. You vanish from yourself. You didn't have a team. There was no handler giving you missions on scrolls sealed in wax. No guild waiting in the shadows with coded passwords and secret handshakes. No wise mentor with a soft voice and a lifetime of advice. There was you and the silence. And if you ever dared break it, if you even hinted at who you were or what you did, you risked more than exposure. You risked extermination. Because the world didn't just hate assassins, it feared them. And fear, in the Middle Ages, had a habit of burning things. You worked alone because it was the only way to stay alive. Every person you met was a risk. Every connection, a liability. Even other criminals gave you space. Thieves worked in gangs. Smugglers had crews. But you were different. You were the one who made people disappear. Not for justice, not for coin, but for reasons no one dared ask about. And so they didn't. At inns, you sat alone, in the darkest corner, back to the wall, one eye on the door, one hand on your dagger. You didn't drink too much. You didn't sleep too deeply. You didn't talk, not unless someone paid you. And even then, you lied. You had no name, or too many. No home, or too many. No friends, just shadows, just ghosts, just memories. Because the moment someone knew you, really knew you, they became dangerous. Not because they'd betray you, but because they might be used, might be tortured, might accidentally let something slip over bread and wine. And that was enough. So you left, every time. Even when you didn't want to. You didn't get a sidekick. You didn't get a lookout. No one handed you clean weapons or double-checked your plans. You were the plan. You watched. You mapped. You timed. You learned which doors creaked and which ones stuck. You counted footsteps. You memorized exits. You packed your own poison. And you tested it alone. There were whispers of assassin brotherhoods, secret orders that trained in mountaintop monasteries, sharing knowledge and scrolls and silent respect. But those were tavern tales, stories for drunk mercenaries and lonely knights. If such places existed, you were never invited, and if someone claimed to be part of one, you ran, or you killed them, because it meant they were either lying or, worse, bait. Because here's the truth. No one wants to be friends with a man who might be carrying your name in his pocket, a man whose very presence could mean someone, somewhere, paid for your death 3 nights ago. Companionship? It was a liability. Love? Deadlier than poison. You couldn't explain the bruises, the missing days, the way you flinched when someone touched your shoulder unexpectedly. You couldn't relax. Not ever. You couldn't trust that the next meal wasn't laced, that the knock at the door wasn't your past, arriving with rope and iron. And people noticed. They always noticed. They noticed that you didn't laugh quite right, that you always faced the exit, that you refused to take your boots off indoors, that you never used your real name twice in a row. They didn't know what you were, but they knew enough to be afraid. And fear turned to whispers. Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to torches. Because if you weren't part of their world, their trade, their church, their family, then you must be something else. And in the Middle Ages, else meant dangerous. Else meant evil. Else meant hunted. So you learned to move like a shadow without being seen, not just at night, but in life. You moved town to town, name to name, bed to bed. You kept your belongings small enough to vanish with, your secrets smaller still. There was no retirement, no old friend to drink with in your later years, no apprentice to pass the blade to, no tombstone, no eulogy, no stories told by candlelight, because no one knew who you really were. And that was the whole point. You didn't belong to a brotherhood. You belonged to nothing. And if you stayed alive long enough, even you started to forget who you were trying to protect. Let's talk about failure. Not in the way we use that word today. Not a bad grade, or a missed deadline, or a performance review full of awkward silences. No, in the world of the medieval assassin, failure had a much simpler definition. You didn't complete the kill, and now you're going to die for it. There were no retrees, no apologies, no lessons learned. You didn't regroup. You didn't debrief. You didn't go back to the drawing board. You were hunted, because if you failed, even once, you had done more than disappoint a client. You had exposed a conspiracy. You had drawn the eyes of every guard, every informant, every rival. You weren't just a man with a blade. You were now a liability, a loose thread, a shadow with a face, and loose threads got pulled. Failure began with hesitation. Maybe the target moved unexpectedly. Maybe their child entered the room. Maybe your hand trembled, just once, just a little. That moment, that flicker of doubt, was the end, was the end. You missed, or you hesitated, or you made a sound. And then the screaming started. Everything changed. The room you once crept through in silence was now a trap of footsteps and metal and fire. The guards, half asleep a moment ago, were now sprinting, howling, swords drawn. Doors were locked, bridges raised, dogs unleashed. You weren't escaping. You were bleeding, running, failing loudly. And if by some miracle you got out, if you ducked into a well, or scaled a tower, or bribed a guard with the last coin in your boot, the worst part hadn't even happened yet, because now your client knew, and clients didn't like unfinished business. They wouldn't ask why it went wrong. They wouldn't wait for your explanation. They wouldn't pay you the remaining silver or offer a second chance. They'd send another assassin, and this one, he'd be after you. You see, when you took the job, you entered into a silent agreement, success or silence, and silence could be achieved two ways. Either you completed the mission, or you disappeared forever. If you failed, you were a thread dangling from a frayed edge of power, a threat to noble reputations, a danger to political ambitions, a reminder that the blade they had hired might now be turned toward them. So they solved it, cleanly, efficiently, with poison, or a knife in your sleep, or a public execution staged to look like something else. Robbery, rebellion, madness. Even if the client was kind, or cowardly, or indebted to you, your failure changed their calculations, because now you knew too much, too many names, too many motives, too many secrets you were never meant to carry beyond the kill. And if your client didn't come for you, someone else would, because your target, the one who wasn't dead, now had a story to tell. I was almost murdered in my bed, he'd say, and the court would gasp, and the guards would be furious, and someone somewhere would swear revenge. You weren't a ghost anymore. You were a man with a face, and soon your face would be sketched in charcoal, nailed to tavern doors, whispered in the barracks of every city within 50 miles. The price on your head might be more than you ever earned in your entire bloody career. And what did failure feel like? It felt like watching a locked gate from the woods, knowing you can never go back through it. It felt like your name becoming poison. It felt like the first cold rain of winter, soaking your cloak, rusting your blade, making your every footstep slower, heavier, more desperate. And if you were captured, that's where the horror truly began, because an assassin wasn't just executed, he was displayed. You were a message, a warning, a lesson taught with bone and rope and fire. You didn't get a clean beheading. You got the rack, the wheel, the cage, the stake. And if they suspected you knew something, they wouldn't even let you scream. Not properly. The pain was slow, inventive, and public. Your failure was theater. The crowd watched, the nobles nodded, the church muttered prayers, and somewhere in the shadows, your client watched too, cold-eyed, silent, unmoved, because you didn't just fail a mission, you failed to disappear. And in your profession, disappearance was the only currency that mattered. Even if you had succeeded a dozen times before, none of it mattered. You were only ever as good as your last kill. And if that last kill didn't happen, then you weren't an assassin. You were a corpse waiting for a final act. So, you did it. You made it past the guards, past the dogs, past the locked gates, the sharp-eyed servants, the silent watchers behind stained glass. The blade slipped in cleanly. No scream, no mess. No one saw, no one heard. Just the soft collapse of fabric and flesh. The final breath of someone who thought themselves untouchable. It's done. But this, right now, this is where your real job begins. Because if you thought the kill was the end, you haven't been paying attention. In truth, assassinating someone was never the dangerous part. That was precision. That was focus. That was one breath held long enough to become steel. The dangerous part was what came next. Because once the target falls, everything else rises. Alarms, footsteps, panic, doors slamming, horns blowing, names shouted, swords drawn. You are no longer the hunter. You are now the most hunted man in the city, and you don't get to savor it. There's no pause, no moment of triumph. You don't get to kneel beside the body and say something poetic. You don't get to clean your blade. You don't even get to breathe. You run, and if you didn't plan your escape before the kill, you're already dead. There's no improvising, no last-minute alleyway, no helpful drunkard offering his cart. You need an exit, planned, memorized, rehearsed. Before the dagger ever left its sheath, a boat moored in a shadowed canal, a bribe slipped days earlier to a stable boy, a sewer grate loosened just enough, a priest who owed you once, long ago, and still fears what you know. That's what survival means, because once the target's name becomes a corpse, your name becomes a curse. The gates close, the checkpoints tighten, riders gallop through the night, the city goes on lockdown. A portrait of your face, crude but recognizable, is already being described to a dozen gatekeepers by a man with a ring that proves he outranks you. And then there's your client. You remember them, the one who hired you, who whispered the name and passed the coin. They're gone, not vanished like you. No, worse, they're protected now, surrounded, cleaned of suspicion, watching the news spread with a cup of warm wine and a well-rehearsed look of shock, because to them, you were never real. You were a knife borrowed in darkness, useful until it cuts too close. They do not meet you afterward. They do not thank you. They do not pay you unless they absolutely must. And even then, it's hurried, untraceable, and always with eyes that say, I hope this is the last time I see you. And if they're clever, if they're cautious, if they're exactly the kind of person who hires killers in the dark, they have already put out a second contract on you, because now you know something. You know what they wanted, who they wanted dead, and how far they were willing to go. That's a problem, so they solve it, quietly, efficiently, just like you did for them. You killed a baron in his sleep. They send someone to poison your wine. You stabbed a bishop during a feast. They pay off the next innkeeper to bar your door and alert the guards. You strangled a traitor in his private garden. Then don't be surprised when the garden's caretaker shows up with a crossbow and an old debt to settle, because even success makes you dangerous. And dangerous things don't get to live long, even if, somehow, you make it out of the city, even if you slip into the woods, or board a river barge, or find a monastery that doesn't ask questions. The paranoia has already begun. You sleep with one eye open. You keep your dagger beneath your pillow. You avoid fires, mirrors, celebrations. You never use your real name again, because you know this isn't over. You can feel it in your bones, in your breath, in the silence between raindrops on the roof. Someone, somewhere, remembers you, and they're deciding right now whether to pay to make you disappear. You don't get closure. You don't get peace. You get a week of sleepless nights in a hayloft that smells like mold and memory. You get stares from people who don't know what you've done but can feel it. You get a pouch of silver that still smells like the noble you left bleeding in bed. And that silver, it can't buy you trust, or rest, or absolution. It buys you passage, a mule, a name scrawled on parchment, an inn that doesn't ask for last names until the next job, the next name, the next client. Success doesn't mean survival. It means you get to start running all over again. A new town, a new target, a new identity, but with more people watching, more people whispering, more eyes behind closed shutters, because word gets around, even without names. The bishop's dead, the baron's throat was cut, the priest was poisoned, and somewhere in the middle of it all, someone says, It must be that shadow again. You become a rumor, a myth, a target. You think you've won, but the moment your blade found its mark, the clock started ticking, not toward reward, but toward revenge. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll die quickly, in an alley, in a fire, in a bed that wasn't yours, beneath a name that was never real. Because in this line of work, survival isn't a prize, it's just a delay. The kind you pay for with blood and silence. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, places where the roads narrowed into footpaths and the wind never stopped whispering through the thatch. People didn't just fear assassins. They believed you were cursed. You weren't seen as a man. Not really. Not once the stories began to swirl around your footsteps. You were something other. A shadow given flesh. A ghost pretending to breathe. A hand of the devil sent to collect debts, paid in blood. No one said it to your face, of course. They didn't dare. But behind doors, over bread and candlelight, they whispered, "He doesn't cast a shadow on feast days. His blade's forged from bone. I heard he walks without making sound, not even on snow. They say he can kill just by speaking your name at midnight." It didn't matter if any of it was true. It felt true, and in the medieval mind, truth and fear were siblings. You might have started as a desperate man with a blade, but by the time the stories had ripened, you were a creature, a demon in disguise, a nameless horror who breathed poison and vanished into mist. You weren't feared, you were mythologized, and myths, in the Middle Ages, didn't get fair trials. They got torches, they got stones, they got stakes, because if you could sneak past guards, surely you'd made a pact. If you could kill a bishop with no sound, surely you were marked by Satan. If you didn't speak, didn't laugh, didn't eat when others did, surely, you weren't human. There were tales told by mothers to frighten children. Be good, or the hooded man will take you. Don't go out after dark. He walks then. See that crack in the barn door? He watches from places like that. And the things they believed, they were dark poetry. Some said assassins could turn into ravens, that their daggers sang when close to holy relics, that their breath could curdle milk, and their eyes shone red when caught by candlelight. Others said you could only be seen by animals. That dogs howled when you passed, that cats refused to look your way, that if a rooster crowed after dusk, it meant you were near. Even your tools weren't just metal and cloth. They were evidence of the supernatural. Your blade? Obviously, forged in a cursed forge. Your cloak? Stitched by witches under a blood moon. Your silence? Proof you spoke only in demonic tongues. And if you carried herbs, gods help you. You were a poisoner, a sorcerer, a bringer of death through root and whisper. You were no longer someone who killed. You were something that killed. And the tragedy? This fear didn't protect you. It didn't give you space or power. It didn't elevate you to legend in the way bards sang of warriors or kings. It isolated you because people feared monsters. Yes, but they also hunted them. If a noble dropped dead mysteriously and you happened to be nearby, the blame was yours. If someone drowned in the well and your eyes looked a little strange that day, the rope was already being knotted. If a child grew sick and muttered in fevered sleep, you had clearly cursed them. It didn't take much. A bad harvest, a dead dog, a passing shadow, and suddenly, the entire village was watching your footsteps, counting your blinks, asking too many questions, whispering behind their sleeves, even if they had no proof, especially if they had no proof, because it's easier to burn a monster than to explain a man, and so you moved, always, never staying longer than necessary, never telling the truth, never letting them see your hands shake when the priest passed too close, never explaining that you didn't know magic, only fear, and how to use it, and how to be used by it, because somewhere along the way, you learned something awful, that being cursed, truly cursed, didn't mean frogs leapt from your mouth. It meant you couldn't be seen without suspicion, couldn't walk into a church without glances, couldn't hear laughter without wondering if it was about you. You weren't feared for what you'd done. You were feared for what they imagined you'd do. And imagination? That's far deadlier than daggers. So you kept moving, kept hiding, kept pretending the looks didn't bother you, kept telling yourself the fear protected you. But deep down, you knew. You weren't just a man anymore. You were a warning, not remembered, not welcomed, just avoided, until they didn't. Until one day, someone shouted, "Demon!" in the square, and then came the fire, poison, the assassin's signature, the silent killer, the clean option, the elegant death. That's what they say, at least, but they're wrong. Poison, in the Middle Ages, was anything but elegant. It was messy, unpredictable, and more often than not, it backfired. Sometimes literally, sometimes fatally, and sometimes with a scream loud enough to wake the entire castle. It wasn't some neat little capsule slipped into wine. There were no vials labeled instant death, no sleek drips into goblets, no slow, tragic collapses as nobles clutched their chests and whispered last words. There was you, kneeling in the dirt, crushing leaves, grinding bark, boiling roots in a pot that smelled like old socks and fear, because medieval poison wasn't science. It was guesswork. You didn't have a handbook. You didn't have a dose chart. You didn't even know if what you were using would work, or just give your target a mild headache and diarrhea. You relied on superstition, folklore, and grim trial and error. Hemlock, belladonna, wolfsbane, arsenic from ore, mercury scraped from cinnabar. If it grew in the woods or glittered in the earth, someone had tried to kill someone else with it. The problem? Nature didn't come with instructions. Too little? Your target would sweat, vomit, and recover, angrier and more suspicious than before. Too much? You'd poison the entire stew pot and end up killing the cook, the taster, the page boy, and possibly yourself. And here's the other thing. Most medieval poisons weren't invisible. They had color, smell, taste. That meant your plan didn't start with mixing. It started with deception. You had to sneak into kitchens staffed by gossipy servants and sharp-eyed stewards who knew every spice and every hand that didn't belong. You had to bribe, lie, impersonate a cook, replace ingredients, time it perfectly, so your poisoned bowl reached the right person after the taster, before the meal went cold, without alerting anyone. It was a dance, and if you slipped once, you were dead. Because let's talk about the tasters. Yes, nobles had them. Some had 3, one for bread, one for wine, one for the main course, and sometimes a dog. Yes, a literal dog. They'd feed it scraps before dinner. If the animal got sick, congratulations. Dinner was canceled, guards were doubled, and your face was now everyone's problem. Even if you somehow got past all that, even if your poison reached the target's plate, there was one more obstacle: the body itself. The human body is stubborn, especially when fed daily on salted meats, rough ale, and moldy bread. You couldn't rely on symptoms behaving the way you wanted. Some poisons took hours, some took days, some caused hallucinations, fever, or fits, all of which might be blamed on bad air, or a curse, or the wrath of a saint. And some didn't kill at all. They just made the target cautious. They'd fire servants, reassign guards, flee the city, change dining habits, stop eating altogether, unless their priest blessed every loaf. And you were now on every watch list, because poison was not a private act. It was betrayal, cowardice, sorcery, the stuff of nightmares. And when it failed, even just a little, it drew more attention than a dagger ever could. And if they caught you, poisoners weren't just executed, they were exemplified. Because poison, quiet, unseen, and treacherous, terrified people in ways steel never did. So they made a show of your end. They hung you, burned you, boiled you, forced you to drink your own concoction. And even if you succeeded, even if the target collapsed during the feast and you were already miles away, did you think your hands were clean? Because now, everyone in the household is dead-eyed and searching, not for a killer, but for a sorcerer, because that's what they believed. That poison was witchcraft, that it wasn't herbs and minerals, but spells and curses, that it was prepared, not in pots, but in rituals, that only someone in league with devils could make a man die quietly from a drop of broth. So they hunted for demons, they called in priests, they ransacked apothecaries, they tortured old women with dried herbs in their homes. And your name, it was never spoken, not because they didn't suspect you, but because they knew you were something else entirely. A shadow, a phantom, a blight, a walking malediction. You didn't leave a signature, you left a stain, one that no amount of prayer or fire could scrub clean. So yes, poison was an option, but not a clean one, not a quiet one, not a safe one. It was slow death for them, and sometimes for you, because in the end, the only thing more dangerous than being feared was being misunderstood. And an assassin with a blade was one thing, but an assassin with a bottle, that was something they'd rather burn the village down to stop. Your name was never meant to last, not in ink, not in song, not even in whispered legend, passed from tongue to trembling tongue, because the moment you took the job, before the blade was drawn, before the name was whispered in your ear, before your feet moved silently across the castle floor, your identity began to unravel. Assassins in the middle ages didn't earn renown, they earned silence. You weren't remembered, you were erased. On purpose, there was no reward ceremony, no poem penned in your honor, no monument on a windswept hill. The man you killed might be remembered for centuries. His titles, his vices, the fall his death inspired. But you would be called only a shadow, a curse, a whisper, if you were called anything at all, because that was the rule, the first rule, the only rule, never be known. Clients didn't record your name. They didn't speak it twice. They gave you coins and a nod, and when the job was done, they gave you distance or death. To be remembered was dangerous, because a remembered assassin could be interrogated, tortured, traced, blackmailed, hunted. So your name was unspoken, even by you. You used lies, cover names, disguises. You were Brother Alric one week, Thomas the woodcutter the next. In inns, you told stories with holes. In cities, you claimed to be from places no one visited. If you stayed too long in one town, you changed your face with ash and shadow. You existed in the cracks, and even when you succeeded, When you killed a man whose power stretched across borders, you didn't leave a mark. You left a question. Who did it? A rival? A lover? A foreign agent? No one said, an assassin. That was too clean, too fictional. They needed more comfortable lies. They didn't say your name because they never knew it. And if someone did, they disappeared too, because your name wasn't just a word. It was a secret, a sharp one. And secrets like that couldn't be trusted with more than one mouth. Even the scribes, the ones who wrote everything, were careful. The medieval world recorded kings and popes, not ghosts. Even when chronicles mentioned a suspicious death, they framed it in divine mystery or political treachery. They didn't say, murdered in his sleep. They said, struck down by fate, taken by illness, punished by heaven, because the truth was uncomfortable. The truth was that men could die, not by armies, but by you, and that terrified people. So they left you out. They told half the story, and as the centuries passed, even the half vanished. If you killed well, your silence was your legacy. If you killed poorly, your execution was your epitaph. And in both cases, the ink that might have recorded your name was never put to parchment, or if it was scrubbed, burned, buried, because your name was a weapon, a liability, a loose end that no one wanted hanging from history's walls. In the quiet halls of monasteries, where chroniclers inked their sacred texts, no scribe added a line for you, not even a footnote. If they heard the rumor, they passed over it with a prayer and a quickened heartbeat. In noble houses, your story was traded for cleaner ones. He died of sorrow, of a jealous husband, of foreign treachery, of sin. Never of you, never of a man with a knife who climbed a wall at midnight and left behind nothing but blood and an open window. And that was the point. Your name wasn't forgotten. It was removed, because to remember you was to remember what you did. And what you did was something no one wanted to believe was possible. A life ended not on the battlefield, but in bed. A noble line severed not by fate, but by coin. A kingdom shaken not by armies, but by a man in a cloak, who didn't even bother to stay for the fallout. So history swept you under the rug, and that rug, it's heavy with dust and bones. You won't find your name carved in the stones of cathedrals. You won't hear it in the songs sung by firelight. You won't read it in the chronicles of great houses or papal bulls. Because in this profession, the best you could hope for was silence, not just in your step, but in your legacy. And when your body finally rotted in some nameless grave beneath the roots of a tree no one tended, that silence would deepen until one day, long after everyone you killed had been remembered and buried with banners, someone would find the dagger you carried or the cloak you left behind, and they would say, no one knows who this belonged to, and they would be right, because your name, it dried before the ink ever touched the page. There's a story people like to believe, that one day, after enough kills, enough coins, enough close calls, you could walk away, that there's a quiet village somewhere, tucked between forgotten hills, where assassins hang up their cloaks and tend gardens, that you could age like other men, that you could grow gray, find peace, drink wine without watching the door. But that's just another fantasy. The truth, you never got to stop. Not really, because you weren't a man. You were a threat with a name someone had already erased. There was no retirement for a medieval assassin, no pension, no home, no reward, just distance. Distance from everything, from every name you ever used, from every face that ever looked at you too long, from every city that remembered just enough to be dangerous, even if you survived, even if the jobs ended, even if your hands stopped shaking when you woke in the middle of the night, you were already gone, because the thing about living as a shadow is that it never lets go. You changed your name again, called yourself a peddler, a hermit, a soldier who saw too much. You found a village no one cared about. You moved into a crooked house at the edge of the woods. Maybe you sold herbs, maybe you patched shoes, but you never stopped checking the door. You never stopped sleeping with a blade beneath the floorboards, and you never, ever told the truth about who you were, because there was no one left to tell. The people who hired you, dead. The people you spared, didn't exist. The people you killed, names etched on tombs, while yours faded from even memory. You lived, yes, but not as yourself, as a rumor that hadn't died yet, as a shadow that no one had managed to catch. Even your body betrayed you. The scars, the limp, the knotted fingers that never held still. You couldn't blend in, not really. You didn't laugh like the others, didn't talk freely. You forgot how. You'd spent too long in silence, listening to your own heartbeat behind stone walls. Sometimes children stared at you. Sometimes dogs growled. Sometimes old women crossed themselves and whispered prayers. You didn't ask why. You already knew. Because when you live like a ghost long enough, people start to see through you. Even if no one chased you anymore, you still ran. From the sound of boots, from the weight of memory, from the dreams you never told anyone about. And here's the darkest part. Deeper than the kills, deeper than the lies. Even if you wanted to stop, even if someone offered you peace, you wouldn't know how to take it, because you don't just come back from the dead. You don't just start being a person again after spending your whole life pretending you weren't one. So you fade, quietly. You sit by the fire and listen to others talk. You smile when expected. You nod when they say something kind. You play the role, but inside, you're still crouching behind a wall, waiting for the sound of armored feet. You're still planning exits, still watching hands, still counting how many people in the room could kill you if they had to. Even in peace, you're preparing for war. And when the end finally comes, not with steel, not with fire, but with time, you don't cry. You're just tired. You lie down in the bed you built in someone else's name, in a village that never knew your real one. And as your breath slows, you don't think of the people you killed. You think of the ones who almost knew you, the ones who saw your real face, just once, and lived. You think of silence and how it followed you, and then, like everything else, you vanish. No funeral, no eulogy, no grave with a name, just a room gone cold, and a story that no one will tell, because the assassin's life wasn't just about killing. It was about erasing yourself one piece at a time until even you forgot who you used to be. You thought it would be different, that you'd be sharp, clean, untouchable. You pictured yourself in a dark cloak, your hood drawn low, moving like smoke across rooftops. You thought you'd be dangerous, respected, maybe even feared. You thought it would feel like power, but that's not what it was. It was cold, the kind of cold that lived inside your teeth even when you wrapped yourself in rags, the kind that settled in your bones after a night hidden beneath a church floor, listening to footsteps pass too close. It was hunger, not just for food, though that was always there, but hunger for sleep, for safety, for a life that didn't involve crawling through mud or climbing walls with shaking hands and a dull blade in your boot. It was doubt. Every face you passed might have seen you, Every tavern you entered might be the last one you'd ever leave. Every whisper, every twitch of a guard's hand, every flicker of recognition, it could all end in rope, or fire, or worse, the long silence that came before the first scream of the rack. You were supposed to be sleek, but your clothes stank of mold. Your hands were calloused and cracked. Your boots didn't match. You hadn't bathed in weeks. You were more rat than man, and no one looked twice, not because you blended in, but because they didn't want to know what you were. You were supposed to be powerful, but every job you took was because you had no choice, because coin was the only thing standing between you and a ditch grave, because someone offered you silver and you were too tired to say no. You weren't climbing the ladder. You were clinging to the edge of it with bloody fingers, and still, you kept going. You took the jobs. You lied. You killed. You disappeared. And after each one, you told yourself, just one more, and I'm done. One more, and I'll have enough to start over, to leave, to become someone else. But the truth, there was never one more. There was just next, because the assassin's life didn't end. It just wore you down until there was nothing left to carry it. You didn't live in stories. You lived in shadows, in crawl spaces and whispers, in a world where every friend was a risk, every job a coin toss, and every breath could be your last. And you never knew which step would be the one that brought it all crashing down. Maybe it was the stable boy who saw your face. Maybe it was the priest who noticed your eyes linger too long. Maybe it was the guard who remembered that limp. Or maybe it was the maid who just knew you didn't belong. You were always one bad guess away from the noose, one mistake from the market square, where they'd tie your hands and list your sins in a voice loud enough for the entire city to hear. And when the crowd came to watch, they wouldn't cry. They wouldn't wonder who you were. They'd cheer because the monster was gone, because the streets were safe again, because no one would ever know your real name. You thought you'd make history, but you didn't. You erased yourself from it. So here's the final truth, the one the fantasy never says. Being a medieval assassin wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even cool. It was survival. Clumsy, painful, and brief. And if you were lucky, you died with your name still hidden. So now you know, not the fantasy, not the story wrapped in leather and glory, but the truth of a life spent hiding behind false names and broken teeth, the truth of killing not for honor, but for coin and fear and a future that never really came, the truth of silence. And maybe, just maybe, you're still lying there in the dark, picturing it, the cobbled streets, the damp stone walls, the rusted blade tucked beneath a frayed cloak. You imagine the footsteps behind you, the whispered deal in the back of a tavern. You imagine that this is the life you'd live, just for a moment, but you wouldn't. You wouldn't last. And that's not a judgment, it's a mercy, because the assassin's life wasn't built to last. It was built to vanish, like smoke from a snuffed-out candle, like names never written down, like stories told only once and never again. So sleep now. Let the cold stone fade. Let the blood dry. Let the footsteps grow distant, because the job is done, and no one will remember you, not in this life, not in the next. Good night.